بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم وفزتم فوزا عظيما فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما صلوات اللهم صل على محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الأنبياء والمرسلين بعد الخلائق أجمعين سيدنا وسندنا وشفيعنا مولانا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين اصطفاهم الله أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق وهو أصدق الصادقين: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to start off by saying thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm actually honored to be in your presence. A lot of the times when I travel, I feel a lot more inspiration given to me than I give myself, and that's exactly why I'm here, to be inspired by each and every one of you sitting here. So thank you for having me. Salawat ala Muhammad. I start in the name of Allah Azza wa Jalla, the Omniscient, the Omnipotent. All praise is due to Allah for giving us His benevolent mercy. Perhaps one of the greatest gifts that exists around us is this very ability to interact with our existence. No longer is our existence a existence without consciousness. Rather, we exist on this earth, and there is some sort of consciousness which we have, which helps us understand the reality that's around us. Not only that, but furthermore, animals and humans are different in the sense that animals have this concept of collective learning, where you and I, not only do things happen to us in a very spontaneous, intrinsic matter, but through collective learning and recording data and the use of language, human beings have been able to collect everything that's been happening for thousands of years before now, and up until the present point that we have today. And it's this process that exists that allows us to interact on a much more deeper level than the understanding that we have now. Because the human being who interacts with this concept of collective learning, not only is he concerned with the past that exists, but now brings up certain questions about how that past fits into the reality of today, and how the past and the history which exists makes up the reality which I live in today. Because when we examine the Quranic exegesis, and this is going to be the 3-day theme that I'm going to be speaking about, the specific story, because if the lesson is understood properly from the story, there can be a lot of benefit, a very vast amount of benefit. And that's the beauty of the Quran, is that you can take one verse and there can be so many different ways of interpreting it and seeing the viewpoints that the lessons of the Quran become almost endless. The Quranic story which speaks about the conversation between Allah Azza wa Jalla and the angels and Shaitan being on the side, and this 3 interactions that are happening, is quite a profound story, in the sense that it sheds light to this very concept which we've kind of neglected, which is the questioning process in the religion of Islam. Because the questioning process and the lack of faith is extremely essential to any faith-based. When I say faith, I'm not saying faith without any logic, and I'll get to that in just a second here. But any lack of faith or any lack of belief is extremely necessary in order for any human being to reach any sort of belief in his life. And this story perhaps highlights this very concept. Because when we look at the story in the Quran, it's quite interesting that Allah Azza wa Jal creates beings, which is Insan, Adam and Eve. And the angels at this point ask Allah Azza wa Jalla, and they say to him, "O Lord, you are creating these beings, where by these beings that you're creating, there is no need to create them, because we are already here worshipping you. That we are already here in worship towards you, so what's the point in bringing these beings here?" Now, a lot of the time when we look at the story, we focus on one part, which is the greatness of Insan, which is quite true. But another aspect of it is focusing on this idea that when God makes a decision, a lot of the times it's our intrinsic motive to even teach our children and say, "Well, God decreed it, make sure you never question it." But this story is quite profound in the sense that you've got angels who've seen beings created in front of them. Not only that, but angels had worshipped God for thousands of years beforehand. They have seen miracles of God being manifested. They've seen Iblis worshipping Allah for years and years. Gabriel is the messenger of Allah Azza wa Jal, and many different angels have different specifications of things they do. For example, Mikael might have something. Azrael, which is the angel of death, might have a specific task. Jibreel has a specific task. These angels have been designated to do something specific. Now the question that arises here is it legal term, and let's use those terms to say that these angels have the authority to question a decision which the Almighty has already decreed and made? Is it legal to say that? Is it legal for them to question the authority of Allah? If it was not legal, if it was not right, then Allah should have replied by saying that you have no authority in asking me, stop asking and stop questioning. But it's interesting to say that Allah, the infinite, with the infinite knowledge and the infinite mercy and the infinite understanding, does not look at the angels and say, "Go away, what kind of knowledge do you have? I know much more than you." No. Allah now at this level says, there is legitimacy in your question, and He replies in the most profound way, and He says, "Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun." I know that which you do not know. God doesn't belittle their questions and says, "Well, your questions are a very basic level, I can't answer you." Because what's the questions of the limited angel compared to the knowledge of the infinite God? That knowledge is vast. If you put it in perspective today, it's like a PhD. It's like a student who comes out of high school asking a PhD professor about let's say a PhD professor who's a PhD in mathematics, asking him a basic 1 + 1 question. You think, well, that's ridiculous. No, this is even more ridiculous. You've got angels who are asking an infinitely knowledgeable God about so many different things. And you'd think, ideally, the reaction would be, well, there's no interest in what you're saying. But quite profoundly, the story sheds light on that aspect, that there is an intrinsic human nature. There is a God-given right for you and I to question even the basic motives that exist around us. Why do I exist? What's the purpose of having this law in my life? There are things in my life which simply don't make sense, and I need answers. Does Imam Mahdi exist? What's the proof for his existence? Is the Quran a God-given book? What's the proof for these different things that we have? It's our God-given right, as the Quran explains, to ask questions about the most basic things. Because you and I do not have the yaqeen that angels do, because we haven't seen the miracles that they've seen. We haven't even seen the Prophet. We haven't seen the Quran being given to the Prophet. We haven't seen any of our Imams. But the belief that we have is of a very strong belief. But the question that arises is if angels who've seen so many miracles, who've worshipped God for thousands of years, who just saw two beings created in front of them, are asking questions. That brings a point for us to say, well, what kind of questions are we asking? And are we asking questions? Are we asking pertinent questions? Or have we stopped the questioning process and threw it out and said, well, I accept things based on the reality that I have today? Because that's a very dangerous thought. It's our God-given right to ask basic human questions. Look at the Messenger of Allah Azza wa Jal. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Look at the Messenger of Allah. It's interesting to state that his first appearance to the Arabian society, you might think to yourself, he would look at them and tell them that, "Oh people, I'd like you to pray," or "Oh people, I'd like you to fast," or "Oh people, I'd like you to give zakat or khumus or salah, or stop doing this or stop doing that." What were some of the most original things that the messenger said to the people? Because obviously these things that he said were not normal. You've taken a society which, in context to the geography, in context to the Persians and to the Byzantines, which were extremely rich, Arabia was not even conquered by the Byzantines or the Persians because it had no value. It was pretty much a group of nomadic individuals living together. Sometimes you hear these terms, which are quite funny actually. Aristocratic Arabians. Aristocratic compared to who? If you're comparing them to the ones next to them, yes, I've got 10 sheep, he's got 200 sheep, I'm very aristocratic. But compared to the Persians and the Byzantines, who had mountains and mountains of gold, who were melting gold to benefit their wars, Arabians were extremely feeble and had nothing. And the proof for that is that they were never conquered by anyone. And it's interesting to say that within this society, the messenger took these same people and made them defeat the Persians and Byzantines and advance their culture and their society. It's important to go back and to say, well, what were some of the first things he said to inspire individuals? Look at the people who were so inspired. Take a story of Ammar ibn Yasir, for example. And in my opinion, this story is still pertinent today in the sense that he is in a questioning process. And believe you me, this questioning process never ends, no matter how knowledgeable you become in religion. Matter of fact, the more knowledgeable you become, the more you question. That's why Imam Ali alayhi salam has quite a profound hadith where he says that the most learned individual is the one who says, I don't know. The most learned is the one who understands that he doesn't know and works on that lack of knowledge. So Ammar ibn Yasir at one point walks inside the house and he tips over a statue and the statue falls and it breaks on the ground. And his mother looks at him and she says to him, Ammar, you tipped the statue and it fell, can you pick it up? And Ammar here being in this questioning phase, this doesn't make logical sense to him. He looks at his mother and says to her, well, the statue which can't help itself can't help me. It obviously must help itself first before it helps me. And she looks at him and says, Ammar, who's taught you this logic? And he says to her, Muhammad's been teaching me. She says, what else has Muhammad taught you? He says to her, well, Muhammad today came down with a new verse which says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. The verse which talks about the burial of the young children. Because it's quite horrific. A lot of the times we think that they used to just bury their children. Look how nomadic the society was. They didn't just bury their children. They actually dug very deep holes. And they would throw them in these holes alive. So that when they do fall at the bottom of the pit, every bone in their bodies would break. And these children would die of course, the internal bleeding and all of the soil that's toppled on top of them. So what happened here is this father, Ammar ibn Yasir, was saying these verses, and his mother Sumayya leaves the room and she starts crying. So Ammar looks at his father, Yasir, he says to him, well, what just happened? He says to him that your mother had 12 children before her. And your grandfather, your mother's father, buried each and every one of them alive. And the last one which he buried did not bury in a very deep hole. So when he buried the child, she was still alive and she took her head out of the grave. And from that point of view, his heart really sank for this young child because he just buried her. She's sticking her hand out to take for him to help her. He says he started crying and realized what he was doing was wrong. I mean, finally, 12 children later, realized what they were doing is wrong. He says the 13th was your mother Sumayya. So Sumayya hence wasn't buried. Sumayya goes back in the room. Ammar looks at her, she says to him, I want to meet Muhammad. Definitely she meets the Messenger of Allah Muhammad. Yasir, the father of Ammar, meets Nabi Muhammad. And after that situation, who were the first two martyrs in Islam? Yasir and Sumayya. It's interesting to say here that Nabi Muhammad had lived amongst these people for hundreds of years. Not hundreds, but tens of years. Tens of years in the sense that they had known who he was. They knew what kind of moral person he was. They knew he was very handsome, he was a very good-looking human being. They were attracted to him in the sense that he had beautiful akhlaq, he would help individuals around him. They had known him. But what sparked this change in their society? What made the difference? If you go back to the original text of the Messenger, he says some profound lines which changed the reality that people lived in. And it kind of shows you where the focus of Islam was then and where the focus of Islam is now, and the gap between then and now. Some of the earliest texts or hadith the messenger used to come and say was he would never look at people and say, oh people, you need to pray. Or oh people, you need to fast. Or oh people, make sure you give your zakat or give your khums because you will go to hell if you don't do that. He didn't even tell anyone to wear hijab. None of these were applied at that point. His most important task in the early Arabian society was, O mankind, reflect for 1 hour, it's better than 70 years of dry worship. In other hadith, it's better than 1,000 years of dry worship. What's he saying? He's saying, yes, the mechanical aspect of things is important, but if there's no intrinsic questioning process about what life is about at the end of the day, those mechanics are thrown out of the window. And hence Imam Khomeini was once seen praying a bit faster. They said to him, Imam, we see you praying a bit faster, what's happening? He says, well, my prayer actually starts when my prayer ends. What does he mean by that? He's saying that the true prayer is what you understand after you pray. It's not just the basic mechanics, but what's important is the outside aspect. That's why it's quite interesting, because in the Arabian society, questioning was never looked down upon. The Messenger of Allah had to literally dig his hand down into the ground and to help these individuals up. Imagine you have a society filled with people who are alcoholics, people who are rapists, people who are violent. Because of all this violence, you've got so many psychological issues that come up. Schizophrenics, you've got people who've got bipolar disorder, people who've got so many different mental, psychological and physical stress and destruction that Messenger of Allah had to deal with that. And it's interesting to say that he had to literally put his hand in the depths of hell and to pick these people up and take them out and guide them. There was no, I'm better than you, I look down on you for whatever question you might ask. But there was this basic intrinsic truth that no matter where you are or what your state is, I'm going to help you up because you are as good as I am. Look at the system which we live in today. It's interesting to note that if a person comes with questions or concerns, we shun them down. We bring them down. Matter of fact, if a person was to come here and say, not here, but in general, in the Muslim world, there is this lack of acceptance. Where if I come to a person and say, Maulana, I honestly, I don't believe that God exists. The next thing you do is probably kick him out of the masjid or shun him for life or ban him for life. That happens in certain places. If a person comes to an institution and says, look, I've got drug issues, we say, no, we don't want this person here. Remove him. He says, look, I need help. No, remove him. If a sister comes who doesn't wear hijab, we're very quick in shunning them and putting them to the side. I have sisters, for example, in our community in Dearborn, who come to me crying. They say, why? Well, there's a sister who was wearing hijab who told me that if I don't wear a scarf, then God will pull me by my hair on the day of judgment. Well, that's a very good way to attract people. That's a very good way to bring people closer. Compare that to the method of the messenger, where there are individuals who are coming to him, saying to him, Ya Rasulullah, I drink alcohol, I don't want to give it up. Look at the logic of Rasulullah. He says to him, what's the next thing in line that you love? He says, I love dates. He says, leave dates for a while. Pretty soon you'll control yourself, you'll be able to leave alcohol as well. Realistic, practical solutions to the problems which society has. Look at the West today. You have clinics where people who are addicted to heroin can go and get clean, sanitized areas to shoot drugs. Because if they didn't have those areas, they would be infected with so many different diseases because of the needles that they use. Now that's a pragmatic approach to help individuals in society who are lacking, who need help. But we are here at our state. As a Muslim today, at what state am I? Am I the judgmental individual who looks at others and says, well, everybody else is lower than me and I am the best? Or am I providing the real-time solutions that society needs? Because if you compare that to the Messenger of Allah, he was putting his hands in the depths of hell to bring these people up, to help them, to raise them. And this openness to this community brought people towards him. At times what we do is we shun ourselves to one specific group and say, this is my small clique and I don't want to open up to the world. But this is a very myopic understanding of the world. Let me give an example of this. Look at the way we used to view the world, look at the way we view it now. Before, way before, people used to look at the world and think that we are as a human society, the only creatures which live here. We are what we are us. And this vision and this very myopic scope of life was soon changed. Because then we realized that, hold on, the earth isn't flat, it's round. This is a three-dimensional universe. Wow. Okay, well that brings up questions. Does that mean there are other species out there? Not only that, but we then started discovering, realizing there are planets out here. Not only are there planets, but there are dots in the skies, there are stars which are billions and millions of miles away. Go further than that, we then realized, we at one point thought that we were the center of the universe and everything rotates around us. We came to the next logical conclusion that no, things don't rotate around us. Things rotate around the sun. Nothing rotates around us. We are not the center of the universe. We slowly started realizing that, my God, as a human being, as a person living on earth, I am part of a galaxy. I am part of this solar system. I'm part of the galaxy. I'm part of a universe, which is part of bigger universes, which is part of another galaxy. My God, I am so tiny relative to everything that exists out there. How small am I? At times I think to myself, we've become so limited in the way we see things. It's as if God is outside of our universe looking down at us, looking to Jibreel and saying, look, we've invested trillions of dollars in everything here. How much have we invested in earth? And Jibreel will say to him, oh my Lord, we've invested pennies. It's not a lot, we've invested very small amounts. He said, well tell me, how productive are they? What are they doing? What are they doing? And Jibreel will say to him, my Lord, they're still fighting about you. They're fighting and arguing about you. They're fighting about whether your name is this or this or this, or they're fighting whether you look like this or look like this or look like this. They're still fighting about you. Nothing productive has come out. And it's interesting and noteworthy to say that we are so, at points in our lives, we are so concerned in people's actions which at times seem very petty. Because when you look at things from this perspective, the things which we focus about in life, which mean a lot to us, become very petty. And all of a sudden we have bigger issues to tackle. Things like, there are areas in the world where human beings don't have basic health care. Yesterday I was sitting, it was about 12 o'clock at night. One of my friends messages me on Facebook and says, look, you gotta check out this video. And I was already feeling depressed because of finals. I didn't need any more depression. So I looked at the video, and to see the way that other human beings live in the world, in Yemen recently, and nobody hears about this. 2 weeks ago, there was a terrorist strike, and there's actual footage of this, where there are people inside of a governmental building. Car comes by the governmental building, parks in the front. The building from the front explodes, and people turn to smithereens. A group of people clumps together in this building, and you can see this footage, this happening, people running around, people screaming, people holding on to their kids. You can see how scared you can see it in their eyes. People clumping together, running around in this building. A man walks in, they think he's an officer, a police officer. He throws out a grenade, takes it out. There's a group of people standing together in a corner, takes a grenade, throws it. Most of those people die and turn to smithereens also. Then the camera angle changes to another camera which is in the hallway. Nurses, because this was a hospital. Nurses running around who are being shot left, right, and center. And I looked at this video and I said, my God, we are sitting here at times focusing on petty issues. Petty issues. Where there are people dying in the world, you don't even hear about this. When we look at things from a big scope of things, we start putting our differences of fighting over this religion or that religion aside. Now my difference with you is not a religious difference, there's a human difference. Because Imam Ali says if a person is not your brother in faith, he's your equal in humanity. Now my worldview all of a sudden changes. But the questioning process is important to say this. What's at stake here is you and I. Some people say, well, why should I question things? What's the point? I feel like I can just believe and things are okay based on faith. And we'll get to that here in just a second. What's the difference between faith and logic? That's enough for me. And I'm okay where I am. What's at stake here is more than me knowing the truth or not. What's at stake is my own humanity. Because now I don't question for anybody else, I question for my own humanity. If I don't get the answers that I need to hear, what's at stake is not everyone else, what's at stake is me. I don't benefit, I don't grow as a human being. This questioning process is extremely important because there are things which seem, as we say in Arabic, badihi or very beginner to us, which actually don't make sense. And we need to question these things. And I know there are questions inside of our heads, but we are too scared to bring them out. Am I human enough to say that I don't have enough evidence for the existence of anything and I need proof for that? There are some people who might be sitting here now who are thinking to themselves, I don't really have proof that God exists. Am I human enough to manifest that feeling on my tongue and say, yes, I don't believe in this, you need to prove it to me? Or am I human enough to say that I don't have evidence for the existence of Imam Mahdi? I need evidence to be able to prove this. Are we human enough to accept our humanity, which is intrinsically built to challenge things? Even the angels challenge things. How many of us, our hearts are open enough to say, there are things which don't make sense to me and I must now question them? That's an important reality. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now, at times what we can do is we trick ourselves into thinking that there are certain beliefs which I believe which don't need to be justified. Things which are widely accepted which don't need to be justified by any sort of belief. This is where we come to the idea of faith and logic. It's interesting to note because there are some people who have made a distinction between faith and logic. And it's as if there are two beliefs. A belief which is built off things which can be logically proven, and a belief which some people call faith, which is not built upon anything. Things like the existence of God, like the miracles of the Quran, like imamat, like prophethood, are logically proven. They can be logically derived and hence are not called faith-based beliefs. There is no such thing where if I don't understand this, then there is faith. Actually, in all reality, faith does not mean belief in something. Rather, logical explanation of things is a belief in something. Because there are things I believe in which I have logical explanation for, and things I believe in which I have no logical explanation for, but I still believe in them. If I told you the sky is red, there's no logical explanation to that. Hence, it cannot be consistent as a belief. So what I'm saying is there is this clear distinction to manifest here. And this is where the secular world interacts with the academic world, because there's this idea out there that people who hold on to religion, or a person who does believe in a God, is somehow less academic or less logical than a person who doesn't. Meaning I am, let's say, a person who's a militant atheist like Richard Dawkins, who comes up and fights against the existence of God. Many people would see him and say, well, he's more logical than a person who believes in God. And in all actuality, the beliefs of religion are as logical as those people who might not believe. The people who don't believe have their reasons. But the people who do believe in some sort of religious structure, in the existence of God, in the prophethood, in the Quran, there is a logical basis to that. And it's not some sort of faith-based idea. Sometimes people are like that. They say, well, God's existence is very faith-based. We don't know much, but He most likely exists. I don't really know. And if you examine it a bit deeper, Shaheed al-Sadr in his book, the Message, the Messenger, and the Revealer, has quite a profound analogy in proving that basic things, even like the existence of God, are logically proven and not only faith-based. Let me give a brief example. He states within his book that the method used to prove God's existence is the same method used that scientists use today in order to prove their many different theories and the things they believe in. Let me give a brief example. Imagine with me that you wake up on a Sunday morning and you walk outside. And when you walk outside, now remember, there's a scientific method here which is to be proven, that we're trying to prove that God's existence is as logical, it's extremely logical and as scientific as any other theory which exists today. That imagine you wake up on a Sunday morning, you walk outside, and you open your mailbox. And when you open your mailbox, you take out, you see a letter which is there by your brother. Your brother has sent you this letter. You might look at the letter and you're saying, well, how do I know this is from my brother? How do I know that this letter here has been sent to me from my brother? You open it, you realize that the address is from your brother. The name is from your brother. The details in the letter are details which only your brother knows. When you look at these different signs together, you think to yourself, well, most probably, my brother has sent me this letter. Because probability states that my brother is the one who's given me this letter. It can't be anybody else because the signs say so. What's the chances of an alien imposter abducting your brother and forcing him to write a letter so he can send to you? Very little. Because the probability of it being your brother is much greater. Take this and put it on a scientific concept. Look at the idea today that exists that our Earth was at one point part of the sun. How do scientists prove that? Well, we look at the elements which are on the Earth and on the sun. We look at the axis of the Earth and the sun, very similar. We look at the rotation speed of the Earth and the sun, very similar. All these different factors prove to us that at one point the Earth was part of the sun. It's a very basic thing. What's the probability that our Earth was part of a much further star? Well, the probability is very small. Because what is the chance of a star being much further away, having the same qualities for the sun that we have here? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa a second salawat of the list of voices. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. A third salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
What's the probability of a much further star having the same qualities as the sun that's around us? Well, the probability is very, very minute because the one that's next to us already has these qualities. So we come to the probable conclusion that our Earth was at one point part of the sun. Look at the same God concept in this sphere. What's the probability of everything around us which is so creatively designed and put in such a prestige nature to be part of a haphazard or random event which creates all of this order that we see around us? Imam Sadiq has quite a profound hadith where he's standing next to his where he's standing next to his companion Mufaddal. He looks at Mufaddal, he says to him, Mufaddal, can you look at the bird that's flying? And Mufaddal says, yes. He says to him, do you see the way that the bird's wings, the feathers on the wings have slots between them so the air can pass through? He says, yes. He says, that allows the bird to go up and down in altitude. He says, Mufaddal, look again. Now realize he's examining a bird here. He says, Mufaddal, look again. He says, do you see how the feet of the bird are small enough to go under its wings? He says, yes. He says, this allows for less air pressure when it's flying. He says, Mufaddal, look again. Do you see how the bird doesn't carry its young ones in its stomach and lays them down? He says, yes. He says, that's so it's not too heavy when it flies. He says, look at the bird once more. He says, yes. He says, do you see that the bones of the bird are hollow? He says, the reason for that is so that it's not too heavy to fly. He says to him, look once again. Do you see how the bird does not need teeth to get its food? Rather, it pecks at its food, so it brings it back to its young ones. He says, yes. He says, that benefits the young ones from eating. Now realize here, he's basically examining just a bird. He's not looking at the multiverse theory. He's not looking at any numbers within infinity. He's not looking at mathematics, none of that. It's simply a bird. Now the question that comes up here is, what's the probability that all the order that exists around us is part of a lack of order? What's the probability of that? Or what's the probability of all the order that we see in our universe being a part of an accident or a very random act? Well, the probability is very small because the reality that we live in dictates to us that any order that we see must have some sort of creative designer behind it. Basic example, if you look at a painting that's in here, any painting that's in here, because it's so organized and so structurally made, we come to the conclusion that somebody creatively designed it. You cannot say that I've got a Ferrari and I took the pieces of the Ferrari, I deassembled them, I threw them up in the air and they all came down as a perfect Ferrari. That's an impossible analogy. Michael Corey actually has a book I was looking at today called God and the Modern Science, and he speaks about the probability of this world coming into existence through an accident. And he says the number is so minute and so small, it's got so many zeros that the zeros would be able to wrap around the earth once. That's how small the probability is. So if the probability for this universe to have been created through a random act is so tiny and minute, that must point to the idea that there must have been a creative designer to create it. And that's basically the scientific method. God's existence is no less scientific than any other concept that we have today. There is no such thing that this is scientifically believed in and this is not scientifically believed in. But it's interesting to note that a lot of the time, when we do examine things from a very deeper perspective, we need to understand that there must be an impact for these things in our lives. Look at the basic concept. We just came out of Muharram, and year after year we commemorate the death of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. You find people come together and they commemorate the death of Imam Hussein and they cry over his tragedy and his death, and it's an amazing thing to do, because as our Imam Sadiq alayhi salam has a hadith where he said, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad, where he comes forward and says that one tear for Abu Abdullah alayhi salam extinguishes the fire of hell. And this hadith is not to be taken lightly, in the sense that there are certain things which have so much power and impact on our world that they can change the way we live forever. And perhaps Imam Hussein alayhi salam is like that. But the same way that we've questioned things and realized that things must be questioned, and that not everything is faith-based, and there has to be a pragmatic approach to things, we look at this concept of crying in Muharram, and it's interesting to note that there are many who take it for face value, meaning I come to the masjid, and I come and I cry, because as we examine, crying is the highest level of acceptance of the truth. When a person is so inspired, their first motive or movement is that they cry. Look at the Quran, for example. When the magicians realize that Musa is not giving them magic, he's giving them a reality, they fall to the ground prostrating and crying, because they have came to a realization. The first form of crying, and over the 3 nights, I'd like to take this theme of crying in its different forms, because the questioning process and having an understanding of our lives is in complete tune to this crying that we do in Muharram. And I'm going to link these 3 together. Because the first type of crying is the emotional crying. It's the crying which is not moral based, where I don't have to cry for a person who's good or bad. An atheist can participate in this type of crying. An un-Muslim can participate. An evildoer, a good doer can participate. This type of crying does not really have a lot of value. For example, when Saddam Hussein, the tyrant, was killed, his daughter came on TV and cried for his death. Now, he was a wretched man. Her crying does not mean he was a good man. It doesn't mean anything. There's an emotional type of crying. And this type of crying is typically the type which is given to us and handed down to us, and we don't understand why. Why am I doing this? Why am I crying here? What's the point? What's going on? And who is this person who died? It's also a type of crying where I walk into the masjid, I cry, and I leave completely unchanged. Whereby when I come back the next day, I'm the same person which left. I leave here, I go back to the same habits and the things which I used to do, and I come back to the mosque, I cry again, and I leave. It's almost like a placebo. It makes a person feel good in the moment, but when they leave, there's not much to change. There's an example of the Quran of a group of sailors who walk out, who leave shore, and they're in the middle of sea, and they're stuck, and they're disbelievers. And as they are in the middle of the sea, a storm hits them and engulfs their ship, and they cry out to God that, "Oh God, if you save us, we will become believers." God says, when I do save them and they go back to shore, then they go back to their disbelief. And this is the first type of crying. It's a crying which has no thinking involved a lot of the times. Now, even this level of crying, I don't want to belittle it, because this can be raised to a much higher level. It can do many different things. The second type of crying is known as an empathic type of crying. This level of tears, now realize how the tears that we shed for Imam Hussein now are much more than tears. They're almost the story of our lives. They're how we interact with our lives and at what stage and level of life we are at. It's almost a yearly reminder. At what stage of your life are you at? How much are you thinking about life? How much are you thinking about your existence? What does this crying mean to you? And it's almost a second stage, is this empathic stage of crying, whereby now, instead of being simply a human being who's emotionally reacting to this incident as a reactionary, you are now an empathic crier, where you take yourself and place yourself in the shoes of that individual in front of you. You embrace the concept of empathy. Empathy is known as taking yourself and putting yourself in the shoes of the person in front of you. This is known as the empathic crier. This is a step greater than the emotional crier. Why? Because now you think to yourself, what's the psyche of Imam Hussein? What's the logic of Hussein? What does Hussein mean to me? If Hussein was an un-Muslim, would I believe in him in the same way? If Hussein was a Muslim, which he was, would I believe in him the same way? What kind of questions am I having in my life and in my brain? These are extremely important. Empathy as a general concept, I don't want to limit it to Imam Hussein, because as an empathic crier, you now learn to observe everyone that's around you. Because how many times have you seen where we are extremely inclusive as a community? We are exclusive and we are not inclusive. Where my mosque is to the same 100 Muslim people which are here. Anybody outside is second-class citizen to me. Because at times it's interesting. The Muslims have this idea, and as a Muslim society we say, if only Islam was given to the world, if only the world knew what Islam was, if only people embraced Islam, my God, what change we would make. And it's interesting because the Muslim doesn't even have an economic system. The modern Muslim today doesn't even have a political system. Matter of fact, the concept, this very notion or concept of anybody who has different religion, they are all second-class citizens to us. A Christian to the Muslim today, at certain Muslims, is a second-class citizen. A Jew is a second-class citizen. And we almost have this idea that Imam Mahdi will come tomorrow and chop heads off until everybody says, okay, we submit, we've become Muslims. This is the same man who his grandfather came to accept everyone, who came to even bring the Jews, the Christians, the atheists, the Sabians, everyone together. The manifestation of that message is going to come and chop heads off and fill the world with blood. Impossible. This is where empathy kicks in. Where you look at Imam Hussein, you think to yourself, this Hussein ibn Ali died, but had Christians by his side. People like Wahab and like John. This Hussein ibn Ali died. If he was a non-Muslim, would I believe in him in the same way? And tomorrow we're going to tackle this question. If he was a non-Muslim, would I see him the same way? This Hussein ibn Ali. What's the reality behind the principles that Hussein ibn Ali lives by? Are they Muslim principles or are they humanistic principles? These are all important questions to tackle. But when I now start understanding empathy, I start to put myself in other people's shoes. And people start to make more sense than me. Now all of a sudden others aren't second-class citizens to me, but they're equals. Because empathy allows me to look at a person and say, their past and their history makes them the way they are, and hence they are as good as I am. Because if I was in their shoes, I would probably act the same way. Let me give you a basic example. About 2 months ago, I was on a flight to go to Miami. Actually, about 3-4 months ago. Flight to go to Miami, and I get on the plane, and I'm sitting there, and one of my friends sitting next to me on the side, and a African American man was sitting next to me, and he was reading the Bible. And my friend looks at me and says, look, he must be really religious, he's reading the Bible. I was like, yeah, probably, because he's reading the Bible. Anybody who reads the Bible or the Quran has to be extremely religious. I guess that's the paradox of the world today. If you have a long beard and a long tishdasha, you're immediately, that's it, you're set. You're a one-way ticket to heaven. But a lady walks by, maybe in her 40s, and she comes by, and from the way she was dressed, I could tell she was of a higher economic class and status. She looks at him, says to him in a very, actually rude way, she says, sir, you're in my seat, you need to move. And the man says, no, I'm in the right seat. He checks his ticket, he realizes he's in the wrong seat, gets up, walks away. She sits. And from the time we lift off, she was rude, but she was very talkative. By the time we lift off, we started getting into conversation, all three of us, me, her, and my friend sitting next to me. And she starts talking about her life, what her life is about, what she does, how she lives. And she came to a point where we started talking about religion and God. And she looks at me, she says, you know what? I don't believe in God. I never really believed in God, and I don't believe in God, in a very stern and upset way. And of course, the intrinsic Muslim in me is like, no. Let me prove to you that He exists. Let me give you the reasons. Let me tell you. Of course, that's every Muslim's reaction. It's always to, let me tell you how wrong you are and how right I am. And it's interesting because a lot of the time, sitting back and saying, let me learn from you, that takes a lot of strength. It really does. So my intrinsic Muslim told me, let me tell you all these different theories and concepts and how God, exists and this and blah, 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 and this here. And I completely ignored her emotional state. I ignored what made her that way. I ignored what things she went through. And I was so concerned in my mind with this lack of empathy, where it's my way or the highway. And all of a sudden, I stepped back and said, well, why? What's wrong? And when I said that question, it's amazing because sometimes you ask people questions which kind of pull a string in their hearts and they start to cry. She looks at me very tearful and she says, when I was younger, my stepfather was a priest. And he used to abuse me, he was Christian. And ever since I've been abused as a young child, I've been turned off by religion completely. So honestly, I looked at her, I said to myself, you know what? Whatever logical argument I give you here, it's not going to work. You are now a human being. I understand where you're coming from. In the eyes of God, you will be judged the way that you will be judged. And all of a sudden I thought about Karbala. Imam Hussein didn't look at Wahab and say, Wahab, you've got to convert to Islam before I accept you, because I'm not going to take you this way. He didn't say to him, Wahab, come sit with me, tell me your type of tawheed. According to our hadith, the tawheed of Wahab wasn't even the tawheed of Islam. He died a Christian, he never converted. And Imam alayhi salam looks at him and says to him, Wahab, you're one of the greatest companions. He even showed him his place in paradise, as our hadith say. It shows the empathic nature of our Imam. Now when I sit, I cry. Not only do I cry because of an emotional state that he was killed, or his head was severed this way, or his arm was severed this way. These are important details. Relative to other incidents which we have today. For example, in World War II, 60 million people were blown up to smithereens and died in the most horrific ways. That now, all of a sudden, when you brighten your horizon, you see Imam Hussein symbolizes something much greater. There's a whole empathic movement. And empathy isn't this fluffy notion. Empathy starts revolutions. When people put themselves in the shoes of others, revolutions can be started. People really rise up and make a change. That's what you see in Bahrain, that's what you see in Syria. Small groups of people who said to themselves, there's an issue here, a change has to happen. And when we look at things in this nature, all of a sudden Imam Hussein symbolizes something greater. All of a sudden his death is not just emotional, but it's a whole movement. The third type of crying, which I'm going to discuss tomorrow, is known as the existential type of crying. And this crying is so profound and powerful that a human can acknowledge his level of existence through this form of crying. And it's not limited to crying, because once you realize your form of existence and what you're doing here, and you answer basic human principles, you now become a much greater human being, and you see the crying in a very different state. It's not just cultural, it's not just made up anymore. No, it has a very profound meaning, because crying is very natural. But in that case, I don't want to belittle the emotional part. The tragedies that happened to Imam Hussein are extremely horrific tragedies, things which normal human beings do not come under. And to die in the way of God, at the end of the day, look at a man, for example, greats like Martin Luther King, greats like Gandhi, did not die horrific deaths. They might have been shot. Nothing as severe as what happened to Imam Hussein, decapitation, the running and trampling of horses on the body of Abu Abdullah, the taking of his family as captives, his daughter, which we commemorate today, Ruqayya, who died on his head as she was holding her father's head. Nothing as major, as horrific as Imam Hussein died. But yet they're still known in history, because at the end of the day what stands is the message and the principles that human beings hold. Imam Hussein today, none of us can say that he's dead. He's as alive as any of us, maybe even more alive than many of us. Because with death, that's when true life started for Hussein alayhi salam. With his death, his life started. That's why for centuries and ages afterwards, people still remember him. And tonight I'd like to commemorate the death of his daughter, Ruqayya. Imam Hussein had many different daughters. One daughter he had left in Medina, Fatima al-Alila. One daughter which were with him, Sakina and Ruqayya. And Ruqayya is one of the children of the Imam, which kind of breaks the hearts. As a father, when you're leaving to go to the battlefield and your daughters are running after you, saying to you, Father, come back, don't leave. And you have to look at your daughters and say that, no, I have to leave because the only option for me is to fight. It's quite a heart-aching reality. There's a story which states Imam Hussein, as he was walking towards the battlefield, his daughter Sakina comes after him, and she says to him, as he was on his horse, she says to him, Father Hussein, come down from your horse. And Imam Hussein alayhi salam comes down from his horse. His daughter Sakina says to him, Father Abu Abdullah, sit down on the ground. Imam Hussein sits down on the ground. She says to him, Father, sit me in your lap. He takes her and he sits her in his lap. She says to him, Father, take your hand and put it over my head. Father, after you die, I will become an orphan. No one will take care of me after your death. Imam Hussein alayhi salam leaves. When Lady Zainab alayhi salam on the 10th night, Abu Abdullah is on the ground. Lady Zainab takes the children and they start on their movement towards the different cities that they went to. One city which they were in Sham, they were in an area known as the Khariba of the Sham. It was a small abandoned building. Lady Zainab and the children and Zain al-Abidin would sleep those night. The daughter of Aba Abdullah Ruqayya was asleep. She was asleep. Her father comes to her in her dream. He says to her, daughter, you will join us very soon. She wakes up crying and screaming, looking at Lady Zainab, saying to her aunt Zainab, where is my father Aba Abdullah? I want to see my father Hussein. Lady Zainab says to her daughter, your father is on a very long travel. He has gone very far away. Yazid hears the cries of Ruqayya. He says to his guards, what is she crying about? They say to him, she's crying over her father Hussein. He says to them, take the head of her father towards her. They put it in a plate and they cover the head of Aba Abdullah. When they take that plate towards Ruqayya, she sees it from far away. She looks at Lady Zainab. She says to her aunt Zainab, I did not ask them for food. I want the head of my father Aba Abdullah. They bring that plate next to her. She takes her small hands and she removes the cloth which was on top of the head. And she sees the head of her father, Aba Abdullah. She says to him, Father, who has severed your head? Father, who has drenched your beard with your blood? Father, who has orphaned me as a young child? She sits on the body on the head of her father Aba Abdullah, and she cries, and then her cries stop. And Zainab alayhi salam takes her and shakes her, and Imam Zain al-Abidin says to his aunt Zainab, he says to her aunt Zainab, remove the child from the head of her father, she has passed away. The tragedy is when she died and they wanted to bury this young child, the woman who was to wash her body comes to Lady Zainab alayhi salam, and she shakes her head and she says to Zainab, I refuse to wash this young child. Lady Zainab says to her sister, why do you refuse to wash her body? She has just died. She says to her, she has black marks on her back. I'm scared that she might have a disease where I can be infected by. She says to her sister, that's not a disease. Those are the whips of shimmer striking her on her back. As she was walking and falling and standing, shimmer would strike her on her back. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين يا الله. Let's raise our hands towards dua, brothers and sisters. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal on this blessed night to heal all of our sick ones. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to keep us and make us leaders in our communities. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to help all of the students in their studies. هذا والحمد لله رب العالمين. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.